welcome to the German Council on Foreign Relations, DGAP, and welcome to today's morning briefing. My name is Jan Stöckmann, and I'm head of the Karl-Kaiser Forum, which is a new initiative here at DGAP for strategic questions, which will be launched later this year. Last week, on the 6th of May, following some hectic forth and back in the Bundestag, Friedrich Merz was elected Chancellor. Finally, as some would say, a bumpy start, others would comment. Since then, the Chancellor, his Foreign Minister, Johann Badefuhl, both of whom are DGAP members, by the way, and other cabinet members have embarked on a frenetic schedule visiting Paris, Warsaw, and Kyiv in an effort to re-establish Germany's voice in Europe. Yesterday, Merz gave his first major address as Chancellor in the Bundestag, starting out with a long foreign policy section before moving on to economic questions. He talked about Ukraine, the Bundeswehr, Europe, and China, among other things. He seems well aware of the enormous expectations in other European capitals, and indeed in Washington, D.C. In the meantime, Ukraine's President Zelensky is waiting in Turkey for what now looks like a Russian delegation without President Putin, raising questions about the strategies of both US President Trump as well as the Europeans, who had set an ultimatum for a 30-day ceasefire by Monday. So what are the top priorities for the new German government? Who are the crucial people in Merz's team? And will Germany live up to the expectations from its partners in Paris, London, Warsaw, Brussels, and elsewhere? To discuss these and other questions, I'm delighted to introduce today's panel. First up will be Anja Wehler-Schöck, who is the international editor and sits on the board of editorial directors at the Tagesspiegel. She was previously editor-in-chief of Internationale Politik und Gesellschaft, IPG, and from 2012 to 2017, she was head of the Middle East office of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. She has a weekly column called Thank God It's International Friday, which my colleagues will be happy to share in the chat. Next up will be Dr. Roderick, who is a researcher at NATO Defense College and also an associate research fellow at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. Until January 2024, he was research director at DGAP and also headed its Alfred von Oppenheim Center for the Future of Europe. Previous institutions included the Polish Institute of International Affairs, PISM, and the German Institute for International Security Affairs, SWP. So Roderick's got an excellent overview of the European think tank sphere. Welcome, Roderick. Last but not least, Jeanette Süß is research fellow at the Comité d'études des relations franco-allemandes, Cerfa, at the Institut français des relations internationales, Ifri, basically DGAP's partner in Paris. From 2020 to 2023, Jeanette Süß was the European Affairs Manager at the Friedrich Stiftung, and previously also worked as on the Expert Council on Integration and Migration. So welcome to Jeanette in Paris. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping announcements. We would like to remind everyone that this event is being recorded and will be uploaded subsequently. We'll kick off our conversation here on the panel with about 5 minutes of intro remarks each, and then open up for questions and answers after about 30 minutes. If you'd like to ask a question or comment, please raise your hand, and when invited to speak, briefly introduce yourself and keep your question or comment relatively short so we can pick up as many as possible. Please keep your microphones muted at all other times. Finally, just a word of thanks to my colleagues supporting the DGAP morning briefing series. And now, without much further ado, over to you, Anja. Can you give us a sense of the Merz cabinet, the first trips abroad, and the first sets of foreign policy priorities that are expecting this new government? What are your first impressions? Over to you, Anja.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jan, for the kind introduction. And I hope that you can all hear me well. As you can see, I'm at an airport which is under construction, so I hope there won't be any disruptions. So for me, the first few days of Friedrich Merz's chancellorship have already shown that he will be a foreign policy chancellor, meaning that foreign policy will be a clear priority for him. And this is, of course, of the highest importance at the moment because it hopefully will allow him to fill a vacuum, not only in Europe, where leadership from a German chancellor has been sorely missing, but also throughout the world, where, especially in the face of the developments in the US, there needs to be clear leadership and a strong signal from democracies around the world. And it will be expected of the German Chancellor to set a counterpoint to the proposals that Trump is presenting, not only for Ukraine, but also in the Middle East. So how do I see that he will be a foreign policy chancellor? He stresses in his campaign speeches, and his first few days in office have can be seen as an indicator that he is trying to make good on these promises. And also last night's government declaration, as you, Jan, have said, foreign policy was the big chunk, and also relevant government appointments. And so, as you mentioned, Jan, he made good on his promise to go to Warsaw and Paris on the first day. And this is really crucial because this moment in time is a Weimar moment. And the Weimar Triangle needs to be strengthened. And it was a huge symbolic gesture of Merz to be the first chancellor to go to Poland on the very first day. And of course, France needs to, the partnership with France needs to be strengthened again. It was also not stressed enough during the previous chancellorship, but Poland, the relationship with Poland is absolutely crucial. Poland is 100 kilometers from the German capital, yet there have been few visits, there have been few attempts to really meet the Poles on an equal footing, and it has not done them justice. On the contrary, it has given emphasis to the PiS campaigning in the current run-up to the presidential election to again lobby against Germany in Poland. So his trip and his embrace of Donald Tusk and his pro-European course in Poland was really important. On the other hand, it already showed where the problems will be within Europe. Friedrich Merz's impulsive reaction to the immigration issue at the end of January was really sorely received by many European partners, and Donald Tusk made clear of his criticism during Merz's visit that unilateral border controls will not be appreciated and will not be constructive, and a constructive approach. He said, we need to jointly secure European borders, and the solution will not be for Germany to do unilateral steps. So I think this will also, this will already highlight a major challenge for Friedrich Merz to prove as a European leader. What I also found extremely important was that the EU plus, meaning Macron, Tusk, and also Keir Starmer from Great Britain, went jointly to Kyiv, which will hopefully be an omen of a joint course on Ukraine and the end of solo or individual efforts by European states. Merz also quickly went to see Ursula von der Leyen for the EU and the NATO Secretary General for NATO, which will be important. Looking at the government declaration last night, foreign policy took up more than half of the declaration. It, of course, highlighted that it's a priority for him, but I think it also had another agenda to present himself as a statesman and to sidestep the domestic issues, especially after the immense difficulties that he faced with not being elected in the first run. And obviously, one of his key priorities will be Ukraine. What stood out to me was his conciliatory note. During his time as an opposition politician, he was extremely critical of Scholz's approach towards Ukraine. And yesterday, he showed appreciation and recognition towards his predecessor. He called his reaction towards the Russian aggression as groundbreaking and historic. And I believe that it's of the utmost importance and that Merz made clear that Ukraine cannot be forced into a peace agreement and that Russia cannot be allowed to move borders by military force. He also put a focus on defense. He said that he would like to transform the German armed forces into the strongest conventional army of Europe. And some already call this a preposterous call, given the deplorable state of the Bundeswehr. But I actually believe it's quite healthy to clearly line out a strategic vision and a clear aim. And the previous chancellorship proved that clear communication towards the population was lacking, that people were concerned, people were confused where Germany was headed. And in times of crisis and times of war, a vision like that can be extremely helpful. It also shows that Germany is hopefully headed towards a more strategic approach in foreign and defense policy. And
allow me, sorry, to cut you off there, Anja, and ask you a brief follow-up question, which will give you a chance to finish the thought. If you could also say a word about the internal setup of the cabinet, National Security Council, something new, the Foreign Office and the Chancellery in the same party hands is something we haven't seen for 60 years. How does the internal setup play? What sort of role does it play in the way the foreign policy will be carried out?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think we can expect much direction in foreign policy given by the federal chancellery. I think a key challenge will be to think foreign policy and security policy in a more integrated manner. And as you just mentioned, the coalition has announced to establish a National Security Council in the chancellery. I don't think that this is necessarily a path to success if the ministries don't stop operating as silos. What makes me more confident that if you look at the personnel in the current cabinet, that they have a strong interest in clearly aligning foreign and defense policy. Johann Wadephul as a new Minister of Foreign Affairs, he has a strong background as a previous soldier. He has a strong background in foreign and security policy. And I think he will form a great team with Boris Pistorius. Boris Pistorius, as Minister of Defense, has been reconfirmed. He, for me, is quite impressive because even though we're in times of crisis, times of war, he's the most popular minister of the cabinet. He also was the most popular minister of the previous cabinet. So I think that they can form a great team and contribute to overcoming the silos that we've observed and that were not helpful.
Thanks, Anja. I'm sorry, I have to cut you off, and we'll come back to you after the other inputs by Roderick and Jeanette. Roderick, a UK citizen who has lived and worked in Germany and Poland, among other places, and is now currently based in Italy. I'm sure you have some European perspectives to be shared as impressions on the new government. Over to you.
I'm sitting in a fairly charmless hotel next to Brussels airport, so maybe that's my perspective this morning. You asked me to talk from a UK perspective, what sort of our hopes and fears are for this government. We can maybe come later to the question whether making the UK happy is a worthwhile benchmark for a German government at the moment. At the moment, all I want to do is sort of hold up a mirror to Germany and maybe recognize bits of how we in the UK see it. I think Jeanette will probably talk about French hopes for this government. From a UK perspective, it's probably the best we can hope for is absence from fear. We're still in defensive mode in the UK. We're still quite reactive. And all we can hope for at the moment is responding to moves from Germany, from the EU, from the US to try to weave together a more advantageous regional and international situation for ourselves. And I suspect the British are probably evaluating the Merz government from the position of sort of four of these fears. So I'll just run through these very quickly. The first one I would call the fear of the squeeze. When the UK left the EU, it was in the hopes that being free and nimble with the capacity to regulate would be a huge example, a huge advantage. And we'd be able to sort of position ourselves between the EU and the US. We then found ourselves squeezed between Biden and von der Leyen, who introduced policies of reindustrialization, of regulation, and to a degree, protectionism. And the UK suddenly found that it didn't have the scale or the market access to operate in the sort of post-COVID, post-Ukraine world. I think the UK government will be looking at Merz and would be much more happy with what it sees now, rather Trump and a sort of Trump light in Berlin than von der Leyen and Biden. I don't mean to say that Merz introduces Trump-like policies, but I think he has the same style of disruptive leadership, that he's ready to sort of pick fights, that he's ready to introduce policies that he sees as common sense. And I think there's probably a sense that that the UK can position itself better with sort of incremental advantages between the US and the EU than it could under the sort of previous leaders. So I think we're probably hopeful about gaining ready access to SAFE, the defence funds, EU emissions trading, and so on. And I think people in London were probably happy to see Merz picking a fight on the supply chain law and ideas of having your car MOT twice, once a year and so on. So I think that's the first thing. When it comes to the fear of the squeeze, we're happier. The second is kind of the opposite. It's a fear of a vacuum in Germany, and I think that the jury is still out there. One of the things that's changed under this government, and actually under Sunak as well, is just how much I think the UK wants Germany and the EU to succeed. And we saw that the sort of zero-sum approach that Johnson and Truss took to the EU and Germany, that we were positioning ourselves at their expense, may have made us look a little bit better in the eyes of the Americans, but it shrank European power in the world. So, if, as Anja says, we hear Merz say he wants Germany to have the largest conventional army in Europe, by all means, the British, I think, are happy with that. It allows us to focus on the Joint Expeditionary Force and high readiness side of things. If we see that Merz is good at golf and speaks nice English, that's great too. It means that we're not necessarily the last people to talk to Trump, but a European still has his ear. And I think even for a Labour government, seeing that sort of triangle between Berlin and Brussels, with Weber, with von der Leyen, and actually with the European People's Party having a majority across the EU, even if it's not Labour's political direction, I think the simple fact of having Germany able to take decisions is welcome. A confident Europe doesn't see the UK as a sort of threat, but a defensive Europe forces the UK to choose sides between the US and the EU, and that is tricky. It shrinks our options. When I say the jury's out, I think we're looking at Merz's position on migration, on tourists, and we're saying, is he actually ready to lead in the way that we had expected? And I think the UK government looks at its own experience and says, the Labour Party had a lot of ambitions for itself when it came into power, but they were sort of fair weather ambitions that it thought it would be rewarded for simply setting a different path than its predecessor. And that reward hasn't come. Leadership is harder than they thought. And I think Labour, equally like Merz, was focused on party and government structures in international affairs and has been caught up by the domestic politics around Europe, Gaza, etc., etc. And I think they see the same around the government structures that Anja sketched out. Third thing is a fear of German nostalgia. I think we saw under the previous German government, Germany sort of freeing itself technically from its economic and its security dependencies, but remaining sort of emotionally attached to its former captors. So people talked a little bit of Stockholm syndrome in London, the sense that you free yourself from your captor, but you remain sort of attached emotionally to it, and your thinking is reduced on China, on Russia, on nuclear under the previous government. I think we see with the Merz government, a chancellor who has very strong individual positions, but whose overall mindset is nostalgic for a sort of whole era. And whilst we could probably agree on the US that we team up where Trump is right in his critique of Europe, and we're probably on the same line with the sort of Cold era transatlanticism updated for today. I think there probably will be concerns in London about the Weimar Triangle and the influence of France and Poland, and whether they can exercise sort of an emotional hold over Germany. I'm on to my last point, Jan. If you want to tell me to shut up, I'm almost there. So fear of nostalgia is the third one. And the final one is fear of the narcissism of small differences. So you'll hear a lot in the UK at the moment as we head towards the UK-EU summit. The international states are so big that we need to put our small differences behind us and focus on Ukraine rearmament, gaining defense scale to produce drones, etc., etc. We want, I think, to have a relationship with Germany that we see each other's political difficulties and we complement in the way that the previous UK government did with Maloney, or New Zealand does to Australia, that we're out finding trade deals that the EU can follow, whatever it may be. I think as we head into the summit, last word, Jan, as we head into the summit, the opposite is happening, that preparations look like they're coming unstuck. Today, France is pushing for greater concessions from the UK on fisheries, Germany on mobility. And I think this is really, the difficulty of first impressions, that the UK government looks at Germany and says, we will judge you by your ability to put aside these things and act pragmatically and see the bigger picture. And from a German and in brackets French perspective, it's precisely to see whether on these slightly sort of political totemic issues like fisheries, like mobility, the UK government is actually going to, act responsibly and put its money where its mouth is, and be less sort of pragmatic and show that it is a responsible partner. So I think first impressions over the next 2 days would be
thanks,
heading in very different directions.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Roderick, for this tour de force through the relationships between London and the new government in Berlin. I definitely want to come back to the mechanics of how these new coalitions of the willing, the new role of the UK in European foreign and security policy can play out, and what this means for the EU as an institution as well. But before we do that, we need to move on from London/Brussels on to Paris and to Jeanette. Jeanette, where do we stand in the revitalization of the Franco-German relationship? What are the expectations in Paris for the new German government? And perhaps a word on Weimar as well, if you will. Over to you, Jeanette.
Sure. Thank you, Jan, and thanks for the invite. So what we have been seeing the last couple of days is, of course, the real willingness of Friedrich Merz and of Emmanuel Macron to really revitalize the Franco-German partnership, especially the French expectation of having, and has been said by the other participants already, like a stronger German leadership when it comes to European policy making. I think that's the overall expectation from European partners, but of course, especially from France, being the most important bilateral partner to Germany. What we can see is, of course, that Macron appreciates Merz because it kind of speaks like a French president, right? With this a bit more like vertical top-down style. However, I mean, this mode of governance is not really typically German. So I think it's interesting what Anja also mentioned, that Merz tried to be a bit more conciliatory already in his government speech yesterday. Merz will have to adapt, actually, as Germany is still, of course, ruled by a coalition government composed of two parties. And this you really have to explain to French people and French politics. That's what we're doing at Ifri on an everyday basis. So there's still like a lack of understanding that there's a plurality of actors in Germany, and compromises are needed between CDU and SPD. Of course, not everything can be decided by Merz himself. Anja also said it, the ministries, they have to stop acting in silos. So we're going to see when it's getting more concrete in terms of Franco-German initiatives, what spats there will be also between France and Germany. What I found quite interesting in the last couple of weeks in terms of media coverage was that in the French media, actually, Friedrich Merz, he was often represented as a neo-Gaullist, especially since his U-turn concerning the US. So Merz advocates for a more independent Europe from the United States since the Munich Security Conference, as you all know. He advocates for more sovereign and powerful Europe. The word sovereign also was displayed in the coalition government treaty. So here we can really see a certain U-turn, although I also thought it's quite interesting what Roderick just said about the German nostalgia. Merz, I mean, was traditionally seen as being a real transatlanticist. So let's see here also what it will mean in terms of concrete initiatives. Nevertheless, the French presidency is, of course, very pleased that the new chancellor shares some of its concerns on the European sovereignty front and strategic autonomy. And this also translates into French initiatives where Germany aligns more closely on the economic front and energy policy. The buzzword here is, of course, nuclear policy, with a more understanding from the German side in defense, of course. So the establishment, or let's say re-awakening of the Joint Security Council, which has been existing for decades, but France and Germany want to reinvigorate, really underscores this commitment, aiming to enhance military cooperation and support for Ukraine. And Merz's openness to discuss the nuclear deterrence, including potential collaboration with France and the UK, of course, also reflects a shared vision for this more autonomous EU. So this was also received positively. And in a few weeks, the shift that Merz undertook concerning the constitutional debt brake, the Schuldenbremse, for defense spending, but also the unprecedented investment plan, the Sondervermögen, up to 500 billions, and his call for a reform of the EU Stabilities and Growth Pact to exempt military expenditures from budget rules. All of this, of course, was received very positively by France and plays into French interests, because France is also hoping to get like a piece of the cake, if you like, when it comes to all these investments. Just a quick word on Weimar. And one bummer, I would say, although there are all these hopes and positive signs for more alignment between France and Germany, doesn't mean, of course, that there's only convergence. There's still some bone of contention between the two countries, for example, when it comes to Mercosur, or the whole question of free trade agreements, and also the question of common European debt, of course, which was rather excluded by Merz, as he has to navigate the internal opposition, also with CDU already uneasy with the suspension of the debt brake. On Weimar, I would say that we can see, France is stepping up actually to become the third angle of the Weimar Triangle, finally. Because before we could really see a more closely relationship between Germany and Poland, traditionally way more anchored. But now, also with the friendship treaty of Nancy, France is stepping up. Let me just recall that, of course, prior to Russia's full-scale invasion in Ukraine, France and Poland held rather differing views on relations with Russia, especially, and support for Ukraine. So France pursued really this strategic dialogue with Russia, emphasizing balance and caution. while Poland always advocated for a strong support for Ukraine and an independence towards Russia. So these geopolitical shifts have prompted France to a certain extent to review its policy towards Poland and the overall security architecture. And this was very much displayed by Macron in his Bratislava speech in 2023. And the Treaty of Nancy now enhances the cooperation between these two in different fields. So we're going to see what will come out of there, because also Germany has a bilateral treaty. So it's not because you have a treaty that there's real cooperation going on. It's always about the willingness, of course, of the policy actors behind. But it's, of course, a very strong sign. They're also signed on Europe Day, May 9. So this is a positive signs. But overall, I would say it's also a sign of a more intergovernmental Europe that we can see. It echoes a more intergovernmental understanding of policymaking these days, which is also a vision, I would say, which is shared by Merz.
Interesting, yeah. Thanks. We'll come back to this discussion. It's 9 o'clock now. I promise that we'll open up for Q&A after 30 minutes. I now invite everyone in the audience to raise their hands by clicking on the button below, or also by commenting in the chat if you want. Let me ask you a brief follow-up question as questions are coming in, Jeanette. Both French President Macron and the German Chancellor, their governments are based on somewhat shaky grounds, as we saw in the Bundestag last week, and as we know from the French situation. So what do you expect realistically what the two can achieve over the next months?
They shared, I didn't understand the word.
The shaky ground, the fact that their majorities
absolutely, yeah, on the domestic side. Yeah, yes, that's something I didn't mention yet. That's true. I think there is a very narrow window of opportunity, but everyone is totally aware of that. Friedrich Merz said that in one of his first declarations, that he really wants to step up European initiatives within the 2 years left of the mandate that Emmanuel Macron still has. I have some question marks here, because we do know that from French politics that the political campaigns start very early. So even 1 year before the end of the mandate, French media is already starting to talk about, who is going to be the next French president, so on and so forth. We have been seeing the Bardella versus Marine Le Pen battle of power, where we don't know yet who's going to be the candidate for Rassemblement National. So, of course, France is very much weakened internally. However, as you know, the French president has a lot of power, institutionally speaking, and that's really what Macron's playing out these days, and he can do that until the end of his mandate as such. So there is a window of opportunity, but it's narrow. So they really have to present initiatives quite soon, which they announced to do. So by the end of the summer, there's going to be a next Franco-German Council of Ministers. So this is, I think, the moment where we're going to see more concrete suggestions in terms of policy initiatives, following up on the Treaty of Aachen and the action plan that came out. But again, everything will also depend on the longer run on who's going to take up power in the Élysée Palace. And if ever we have Rassemblement National, it's a bit like with the US and Trump. We don't really want to see it, but we have to prepare for this scenario. So I'm a bit concerned about this political situation, that's for sure.
So thanks, Jeanette. Since I don't see any questions yet, I will come back to you, Anja. You talked about high ambitions and a couple of steps that Merz and his cabinet members seem to have taken right in the first couple of days. Ambitions are high. Now, the question is, can he live up to them? Let's talk about sanctions on Russia, perhaps. So there was an ultimatum for Monday for a 30-day ceasefire. The EU has prepared the 17th sanction package, which has been provisionally approved by ambassadors, including the 200 ships in the so-called Russian shadow fleet. Now, given that Russia doesn't seem to play along in the way that Europeans are trying to pressure Putin, do you think that Merz, along with his European comrades, will be successful in doubling down on on this pressure, on the ultimatum, and their policy on Ukraine? Where do you see things going?
Well, with regard to the meeting that was proposed, I'm quite skeptical. Since neither Putin nor Trump seem to be willing to participate, I'm highly skeptical that we will see a big leap forward coming out from this meeting. With regard to sanctions, I think it is crucial that Germany and the EU be more stringent when it comes to their sanctions policy. On the first hand, there is still much room for stricter sanctions towards Russia. But I think the most decisive point is that they need to be more strictly reinforced, because at the moment we're still seeing loopholes where companies manage to work around the sanctions policy, and Russia's economy is still not taking the hit that these sanctions are intended to take. And I think until that is the case, Putin's war machinery will be well oiled, and he will be able to move forward with his war. So I think sanctions policy, the stricter implementation of the sanctions policies and the expansion of the existing sanctions will be a key in moving towards ending the war in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. And what about weapon deliveries? Merz, during his time as opposition leader, was one of the strongest supporters of sending Taurus weapon systems to Ukraine. Now his government has become somewhat more silent on this issue. Yeah. So where do you see his standing here?
It's actually one of the points that I have been most closely watching, because the Taurus long-range missiles were one of the key criticisms of Merz during his role in the opposition. He called out Chancellor Scholz for being too weak, for not deciding to deliver Taurus to Ukraine. So I've been very closely observing his rhetoric on that. And as you've said, he's become very silent. And when directly asked whether he will be willing to deliver Taurus to Ukraine, he has been somewhat ambivalent. He's said that this needs to be in coherence with the European partners, which is, of course, an important step. But from my point of view, I don't see a lot of resistance from the European partners. But of course, in the current coalition government, this also needs to be discussed with the Social Democrats, and Matthias Mirsch has already reinforced the SPD's hesitancy towards delivering these long-range missiles to Ukraine. Personally, I think this could really be a game changer, and I'm looking forward to him taking a more clearer stance, also a more aggressive stance towards a coalition partner in delivering these weapons to Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot. In the chat, Karl is asking about the benefits of Russian frozen assets being used to rearm Ukraine, and Ronald Manardos is asking from Athens about Merz's policy on Turkey with regards to Eurofighters' inclusion of Europe's defense architecture. Roderick, I noticed that you've been busily taking notes, so I also want to give you a chance to react and indeed pick up Joanna's and Ronald's questions if you want, but also react to your fellow panelists. Over to you, Roderick.
Thank you, Jan. You asked about the sort of the coalition of the willing, and Anja touched on it as well. And you know, UK's place in that and how it comes together. I think we are inevitably in a phase of sort of muddling through, which actually quite suits the British. What I think in the UK they hope for is that we get sufficiently practiced in you know, efforts to almost do something that when we have to, we actually will. And I think people in the UK look back at the kind of the practice run that they had when Skripal was poisoned, that when Navalny was poisoned, that the UK was very quickly able to support the German government in pointing the finger at Russia, introducing sanctions, putting together these sort of packages, and that having almost surprised ourselves by having a capability to cooperate together on tricky issues, it becomes self-reinforcing, and Europeans gain the confidence to start doing these things together. So I think in the UK, this slightly odd thing of putting together a coalition of the willing to go into Ukraine or to put pressure on Putin and then sort of backing away a little bit, we kind of take that in our stride a little bit, more than perhaps the French or the Germans. But we are dealing with a tricky situation where, frankly speaking, the US is more a spoiler than an enabler on these. Anyway, so it makes it tricky to plan for, and no matter how much Europeans prove themselves, I suspect that won't enormously influence what's happening in Washington. We're also heading into a situation, I think, where the big 3 or 4 countries in Europe matter more than they did before. So that sort of coalition building where you could have the US, the UK and Baltic or Nordic states is not going to fly anymore, which makes coalition building a bit trickier. And we have a slightly lopsided situation where I think the French have quite a clear idea of how the European security architecture ought to look. And the UK and Germany are still hedging. So it's a tricky old process when it comes to the coalition of the willing. But I think we will find that as we practice failing, one day we will actually succeed. I think we're quite relaxed about that in the UK. I'd come at the Turkey question a little bit from the same angle. I mean, I take note of Greek fears about Turkey from a UK perspective. An inclusive European security architecture is welcome, though, and the debate about whether you have a European pillar inside NATO or a NATO pillar inside the EU, which includes the UK, Turkey, Norway, and co. I think the UK knows where its preference lies, but we're quite open on both of these things. So I think we would look at the Turkey question in a different way there, that we do want an inclusive architecture. On Ukrainian assets, in a way, I think it's less about what they might be used for, rearming Ukraine, and it's more about, from a British perspective anyway, our financial and economic reputation, and whether assets are safe, and also a sense that sanctions and so on have led to a disintegration of the global financial system, haven't had the effect that we wanted. So if this confiscation of assets leads to further disintegration, that we might be sort of shooting ourselves in the foot a little bit when it comes to our leverage over other countries. So I'm skeptical about assets being used to rearm Ukraine, but more because of the issues of reputation than what they'd actually be used for.
Thanks, Roderick. 60 years of diplomatic relationships between Israel and Germany. There have been visits forth and back in the past couple of days. Anja, there is a question in the chat by Lutz Uphoff about a potential visit of Netanyahu to Germany upon Merz's invitation being received by the EU. Perhaps a word on Israel policy by the new Merz government in general would be much appreciated.
Of course, this week saw the anniversary of this incredible relationship between Germany and Israel. And if you look at the genesis of the diplomatic relations, it's really quite a miracle that official relations between Israel and Germany were able to be concluded so shortly after the horrors of the Holocaust. But you saw that over the anniversary and the cause for celebration, of course, there was the shadow of the German government's inability to find a good course to deal with the Netanyahu government in Israel at the moment, and we've seen this mirrored in in Foreign Minister Wadefuls declarations, and also in Friedrich Merz, the Staatsräson, which has been sort of the buzzword for German-Israeli relations, was emphasized. But it is also often left unclear what exactly this means and what it specifically entails when it comes to supporting Israel. So we see this ambiguity, and maybe this is also the motive of our relationship. It's a relationship like no other. And you mentioned the visit, the possible visit of Netanyahu. I think it is again a testament to Merz's oftentimes rash behavior that he, without any pressure, issued this invitation. Of course, it is completely unthinkable that Netanyahu or any other Israeli politician will be arrested in Germany. But again, this means a certain ambiguity because Germany was one of the leading forces behind the Rome Statute, behind the founding of the International Criminal Court. And so for Germany to say, well, we've this arrest warrant being issued, but we won't respect it, of course, leaves us in a dilemma. I don't think this dilemma can be easily resolved. I thought it was a bit premature that Merz issued this invitation and put himself in this extremely difficult position. So we will have to see how this will move forward.
Jeanette, you touched on this in your opening remarks, but Nicole Koenig is asking again about nuclear policy. Macron's proposed nuclear dialogue and what might come out of it now that Merz seems to be more open to it. What do you think, Jeanette?
Yeah, it's a crucial question because we don't really know the details yet of this announcement. Of course, I think there has to be a strategic dialogue which has to be opened up, especially between Germany and France, but also together with Poland and the UK. The UK is, of course, key here to step up nuclear deterrence. So I think this is also a very important element within Weimar Plus. What is interesting is also that we saw that in the friendship treaty of Nancy with Poland, France also explicitly noted that nuclear deterrence can be extended to Poland. However, the whole questions about control, who's in control, who's in charge. And I think it was a very political discussion, very polarized discussion in France internally about this. If France would buy out, would lose its sovereignty by expanding its nuclear deterrence to other European partners. This was instrumentalized by the Rassemblement National quite a lot. So Macron has to be very cautious when it comes about this expansion of nuclear deterrence. And so I think so far what we see as the future possibility is that there might be an expansion, but the control as such will stay within France. So that's more or less the red line I can see here. But the details are not really known. And of course, they're not known because it's a highly sensitive issue. So it's going to be discussed internally closed door. And I think it's, the way to go as well.
Thanks a lot, Jeanette. We've got two questions by Rolf Clement and Michael Treacy in the chat about the relationship between larger and smaller states in the EU. And perhaps we can take these questions up together. And perhaps this is something for Roderick. Rolf Clement comments that traditionally Helmut Kohl and others have been sort of the lawyers for the smaller EU members, and now things seem to be shifting. We talked about Gaulers, the more intergovernmental approach, especially led by the bigger countries. What do you make of this shift, Roderick? Is there a trend? Is there a danger? What does this mean for the future of the workings of the EU?
Small and big member states. I think the logic of the Weimar Triangle a little bit is that if you have a club of the larger member states coming together, then they in turn represent the interests of smaller states in their geography. So it's East plus South plus Germany, sort of taking them all into account together. And I think of the Weimar Triangle as also being a sort of a coal idea, and that relationship between France and Germany also needing to be complemented by a relationship between Germany and Poland. Tricky is, I think, actually primarily mid-sized states, Spain, Italy. Where do they fit in this system? A little bit, where does the UK fit if you do go back to Weimar? And then if smaller states are unhappy with it, then it's either a Cyprus or a Malta pressing to retain unanimity in European foreign and security policy that actually makes them more vulnerable, because it means that they come under pressure from third countries to exercise a veto in European foreign and security policy. Or perhaps there's a sense of smaller countries, particularly in the Baltics, which previously were able to take sort of sharp positions on Russia and international affairs in order to sort of prod other countries into coalitions of the willing, maybe picking fights, and you've got a sense of sort of moral hazard there, of them sort of trying to draw the bigger states into slightly riskier action there. So I don't think you'll ever resolve that. But I think that the shift to a Weimar Triangle setup ought to have a respect for smaller states built into it, because it's within this sort of more coherent sort of Cold Era idea. If I can say a word on the nuclear side of things from the UK, also I can also shut up. Don't mind either way.
Go.
All right. So I think from a UK perspective, the nuclear debate, and Jeanette said, the UK key on this, very tricky for the UK because our system is so integrated into the US system. Trident is very much sort of part and parcel of the US setup. So this discussion in Europe is very tricky. Also because I think in the UK, voters think that this is one of the things that we can use as leverage in talks with Europe. So nuclear capacity, large military capabilities like an aircraft carrier, the Joint Expeditionary Force that were active on high readiness stuff, and the scale of, for example, BAE Systems, that we just have a lot of sort of scope to produce drones or whatever in the UK. And actually all of these things, either because they're tied into the US system or because we built them up under a previous sort of strategic assumption that the US would remain as we've known it for the last 70 years, aircraft carriers and so on. Actually, they're not leverage, and they're dragging us down a little bit. So the mismatch between UK voters thinking that we can use this to sort of get concessions out of the Germans and the Europeans, and the reality of it that we have a lot of legacy systems that are costly and that we need to adapt for ourselves, that I think is a tricky element too. Thanks.
Roderick mentioned Gulf and English as factors for Merz's first meeting with Trump. Now, Chong Hock Lee in the chat is asking about expectations for their first meeting. Can I send this question your way, Anja? What do you expect of the Merz-Trump relationship? And jokes aside, of course.
Well, it's certainly quite a challenge, but I think the change from Scholz to Merz gives not only Germany but Europe a good chance. I think from his habitus and from his character, Friedrich Merz is much better suited to confront and negotiate with Trump than Olaf Scholz was. And they also both have a knack for a certain emotional and rash behavior, and maybe this will prove to be a good match. I think with Trump, you need to be sure that you come across as a strong negotiator, that he respects you. I think there is a fair chance that this will happen with Friedrich Merz. You also need to make sure that you put something on the table for Trump to give him the chance to go out as a winner, to be able to present to his followers that he got something out of a meeting. And I think this could go in the direction of an EU trade agreement, for example, or as I hear now from the current news updates, more defense spending. What we just heard out of Istanbul was that Foreign Minister Vadeful apparently said in his meeting with Marco Rubio, his US counterpart, that Germany might be willing to move in the direction of 5% defense spending. I think higher defense spending by Germany and increased purchases from the US would be something that could be offered to Trump. Although I think against the developments of the past few weeks and the increasing unreliability of Trump as a partner for Europe, and we should think very closely about purchasing more defense systems from the US because he's not shy to use any instrument at his disposition as a pressure mechanism. So this is definitely something that we need to consider.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot. We've got a question about the UN peacekeeping ministerial in Berlin yesterday. There was also a joint press statement with Antonio Guterres and Friedrich Merz, so perhaps a word on global governance questions. And there's a question by Reinhard Rösch about Merz's background in the border region, Belgian, French, and German border region, and if that may have an effect on him being more open to French ideas than Scholz was previously. So this is something for Jeanette, I think. And we have a question from my colleague Milan. Over to you, and please keep it brief since we only have a couple of minutes left.
Yes, good morning. I want to ask about Hungary and how Friedrich Merz and his government will play this question, not only in terms of European unity challenge from Budapest, but also when they deal with European agency and the tendency, and by now it's more than tendency of Hungary to block EU decisions in foreign security policy. They cannot avoid this, but I'm interested in their strategy. I'm hearing in Berlin that they will have to look at this file early. And if you heard, especially Anja, if you heard anything on that.
Thanks a lot. So given that we've got 4 minutes left and we have at least 3 questions, the UN, proximity to France and Hungary, let me allow each speaker in reverse order to, by way of a closing statement, pick up any questions that are left out there. So we'll go Jeanette, Roderick, and Anja.
Yeah, so very quickly, because I already sketched out like what are the potential alignments between Macron and Merz when it comes to this overall concept of strategic autonomy, also the willingness of making Germany way stronger when it comes to its military capacities. Of course, this is very much in line with France's idea of making the European Union more strongly. Given his background, yeah, it's of course an interesting detail to mention that he's coming from Sauerland, so this region, North Rhine-Westphalia. He's really one politician in the tradition of the Helmut Kohl era. Also another politician that marked his political career quite a lot is Wolfgang Schäuble. So here we can see that there is way more of a Franco-German reflex where he has been socialized with. So this is something I definitely share. However, he very much underlined in all his recent declarations, also yesterday, that Poland is as important as France, and that's why he also traveled to Warsaw the same day. So I think he really, really underlines the importance of the Weimar Triangle, and we will see if there might be some even like competition or jealousy emerging from that between the Franco-German couple and the Franco-Polish couple, and now the new Franco-Polish couple.
Roderick, over to you.
Thank you. Two things. On what Merz can say in Washington, I think the Trump picture is relatively clear, and Anja sketched that out. We know that he thinks that Europeans take him for a ride, and Germans in particular, and that's defense, that's pharma, that's trade. I think the trickier thing is J.D. Vance, is Peter Thiel, is these people who have a hostility to Europe and Germany, and it's Trump has a point. We have been free riding. I think with Vance and co, it's trickier because what they dislike is tech regulation, our model of democracy, etc., etc. How do you make concessions with that, or how do you push back? And I think that's a trickier question. We did see the Vance sort of position softening in his conversation with Ischinger the other day, but that makes things trickier because we understand it less, I think, than we did before. So that for me is the question mark. And maybe just a footnote on the nuclear side of things that I should have mentioned. I think the UK would see it not just within a European context, but a global context, and the question of sort of nuclear proliferation, whether sort of nuclear sharing within Europe reduces nuclear proliferation because, for example, the Poles don't feel that they need to sort of go down that path themselves, or whether it increases it because the Ukrainians feel sort of outside a protective umbrella and do feel the need. So I think we would see it also in the context of sort of global nuclear proliferation. Thank you.
Thanks, Roderick. Over to you, Anja.
Yeah, I think Orban could really be the test for Merz's EU leadership, because at the moment we need a strong Europe, and I think this can consist of a motor of the strong EU countries like France, Poland, and Germany, the Weimar Triangle as a motor for Europe, but also taking along the small states. And I think that the point that was raised earlier, that Germany has a tradition of having close relations with the small EU states and taking them along in the European project, is really crucial. And I think Merz could play this role in his foreign policy speech in January. He outlined his ambitions in this regard, and I really hope that he follows up on it. With regard to Orban, I think now is the time to really move from the veto power towards a consensus policy. And this could consist in trying to change the rules of the EU to make sure that those who are willing, a European coalition of the willing to take the EU project forward, can move ahead without Orban's power to block decisions. But this could also consist in forming smaller circles that single out specific projects where Orban doesn't have this power of blocking. We need to make sure that as Europeans, we stand for democracy and rule of law. And if Orban is not a part of this, then we need to be extremely clear towards the Hungarian government that this is not acceptable, neither with regard to our internal proceedings nor with regard to Ukraine and other priorities that the EU is currently pursuing.
Thanks so much, Anja Wehler-Schöck, Roderick Parks, and Jeanette Süß. Have a safe flight, Anja, and have a lovely day, everyone else. Thanks for joining DGAP. We'll be back with the next morning briefing next Thursday. Bye-bye.